my perspective is and always has been around retail that, it's ultimately a storytelling opportunity, right? And so at the time, you were looking at, really rapidly growing digital brands, anything from Warby to Everlane and otherwise. And what they were doing was having a really great and sort of restrained experience on the web that really allowed them to tell a really complete story, which is a massive opportunity and something really meaningful for the consumer. So, in absence of a huge amount of brands that were direct to consumer and online only and otherwise, you could really establish real loyalty. You could also build very sustainable advertising mechanisms to build a very profitable business. And that was a very exciting moment, right? But more and more people saw the opportunity and were coming to the table to develop more and more brands, and they've become more and more niche, and they're all going after the same consumer, and it gets unsustainable economically speaking. Meanwhile, you see the rise of major retail platforms, major marketplaces like Amazon and otherwise, which are great from a utility perspective, right? For me, and really with online shopping in general, it's an amazing thing if you know exactly what you're looking for. And that level of utility and convenience is great. But at the expense of the utility and convenience is discovery, right? It's really hard to come across these new brands. And so for all of these younger concepts that were really focusing on, really leveraging, Facebook, Instagram, Google to really build these businesses, it's hard. And it's become increasingly hard. And to really stand apart from that crowd presents a lot of challenges. And my perspective is, and has been for a long time, that physical is a real savior in that regard, where a lot of people have written it off as sort of an irrelevant channel and an irrelevant vehicle for storytelling for brands. My perspective is quite the contrary, though, where you can see it much more in concert with this digital universe, where yes, I can go and order something with absolute convenience online if I really need it, whether it's like toothpaste or a laptop, right? But if I really want to sort of get a sense of the nuance and narrative between different denim brands or footwear brands, or I'm really trying to buy into a particular lifestyle and narrative behind a product, or I'm really trying to sort of separate the signal from the noise outside of a lot of these technology products and otherwise that are very easy to shop for online, physical has a huge amount of power there, because ultimately, right, that side of the industry is really driven by, first of all, narrative, right? The other is around social validation. And the other is around the sense of identity. So, I always go through this exercise with people on the team when we're walking through an airport or otherwise. And, we look around at the room and say, you see all sorts of people wearing different backpacks, right? And the question is always, why do all these people have different backpacks? Yeah. And it's ultimately that they saw one that really spoke to who they see themselves as, who they would like to be. And it's a very sort of subtle and largely subconscious thing. But when you're at your most confident around those sort of moments and you feel really sort of excited to buy something, you're really excited to wear it, is when you have that extra bit of texture in the story that gives you that extra sort of spring in your step, where you can say, well, it's made with sustainable materials, or it's female founded, or it was this repurposed material from XYZ brand. There's a lot of different pieces there that can give you a real sense of identity and purpose. And it's really hard to do online, and it's really hard to do well coherently online. And so physical to me has always been this opportunity. And so just always been trying to sort of think about, how do you bring people together regardless in a way that feels really good? And then how can you give them a really positive and memorable reason to keep coming back? And then how can you make sure that those stories and, you as the retailer, as the custodian of those stories, how can you put that together in a really, really compelling way that, feels really dignified and very perennial and sort of retail as it was 100 years ago, but with a more progressive belief system?
Yeah, I am 100% in agreement with this belief that you hold as well. It's kind of the basis of this show, and everything that I've learned has been this difference between online can be so convenient, but it can also be kind of shallow. And there are a lot of products where you want to touch and feel and you want to talk to somebody and you want to have that visceral experience with the story behind the product. And that gives you that like extra incentive to buy and then buy again and then tell people about it, which is a huge, powerful part of retail. And it kind of starts to separate out between buying and shopping. So like if I just need to go buy some zip ties, I don't need to talk to a sales associate about the best kind of zip ties that are female founded. I'm going to probably go to Amazon and get them in 2 days. But if I'm trying to buy a new pair of shoes or a dress to wear to a wedding, there's a piece of my identity in that. And I want to have more story behind it. And I love that you've kind of seen this opportunity within that space even before a lot of other brands did and said, okay, all these D2C players can say that retail is dead and dying, but actually retail is going to be the thing that saves you guys in the end, which we're seeing now is starting to save a lot of D2C brands who are looking for profitability. What I find so interesting about neighborhood goods is it's this like modern, almost store in store concept where you have multiple brands. Each brand has its own kind of place in the store so you can tell those stories of the brands. You're giving each one its own kind of setting within the store. So it's almost this concept of kind of a department store. And I think all of us have kind of walked into a Macy's or a Dillard's in the last 5 years and can quickly say that the traditional department store is a little bit out of date. But I'm curious from your perspective, when you were looking at the space, what did you see that was broken in that traditional department store kind of concept and model that you could fix with neighborhood goods?
It's a great question. There's a lot of different pieces to it. So, I mean, I think, first of all, for me, can't take too much credit for all the sort of degrees of recognition along the way. You know, back in 2014, Unbranded was largely born out of like just a personal level of excitement around all sorts of different entrepreneurial things that were happening in and around Dallas, but more generally around the country, and wanting to give it a home and sort of test a new sort of format around it. And it just really sort of took on a life of its own and has been run by the city since. One of the things we learned very quickly in building that out was that giving people space can unlock a really special relationship with the people that come in to visit. And you can give people a really good reason to show up, right? And to keep coming back, whether it's in the form of events or a changing assortment or otherwise. But there were a lot of things that we hadn't really thought about that easily went wrong. So, you know, in working with a younger mix of brands, most of them have full-time jobs and can't be there to staff themselves all the time. Some brands would be doing really well and could really build out a really special space for themselves, whereas others were showing up with a card table or a chair and just hoping for the best, right? And so for me, when I started thinking more about what a more permanent version of this idea could look like, and had teamed up with my co-founder, Mark, what had really sort of given it a lot of life and a lot of energy was really learning some of those lessons and sort of thinking about how do you build something more coherent and cohesive that reduces the burden on those brands and allows everyone to be operating in a uniform system that means that it's a very sort of level playing field, regardless of whether you're a brand new brand or an extremely well-established brand. And in starting to think about what this model could look like, where you're recognizing the need for modern brands to get into physical retail. It's seen as a solution to build towards profitability. Physical has a lot of power in terms of building a very loyal customer. And it also has a lot of power in terms of creating long-term relationships that tend to be much more productive than those of digitally acquired customers, where it can be less expensive. And how do you sort of reconcile this piece around essentially what you're talking about is like pop-ups, right? With also what you recognize from the consumer, which is that if you can give them a really good reason to gather, and you can give them really great storytelling, and you can offer this sort of vehicle that makes it really easy for everyone, how do you put that all together, right? And so when I started first writing up the idea, I referred to neighborhood goods. The working name for it was department store. And it wasn't that we were building a department store, right? It's really more department stores as they were 100 years ago when they first started out. But it became a really useful expectational framework as to what you would find when you go into the room, as well as helping, brands and consumers wrap their head around what it was exactly that we were trying to do. So, for these department stores, I think ultimately they lost track of consumer behavior and preference, right? And so, the first JCPenney was 8 or 9,000 square feet. And it featured a really local mix of products, very well edited. Now, your average JCPenney is over 100,000 square feet and sort of speaks to everyone. And, for me, I think you look at those sort of concepts and you lose the ultimate currency of retail, which is relevance. And, in looking at what we could develop, we knew that we needed, sufficient space to do it, but you didn't need 100,000 square feet.
Yeah.
We also knew that you needed a good balance of different brands to come into the space, as you would expect from a department store. You have to touch all these different categories and make sure there's balance. But you also don't want all of them. You want to make sure that you say no far more than you say yes, that it has a perspective, and that it's unique from one area to the next to make sure that it actually speaks to the audience there. The other piece to it is thinking about how every department store in the country largely has the same mix of products, largely looks the same, largely attached to the same types of developments. For us, we wanted to have, mindfulness about where we were opening and unlocking a different feature set that would befit different goals for different brands. And so the end result, right, is for us, you can look at it as a department store. We have restaurants, it's our staff, it's our fixtures, it's one coherent and cohesive design language, right, from beginning to end. And there's parameters in which brands show up. But the brands that are there are brands you would otherwise not find in physical retail. They're there on a non-seasonal basis. So they rotate in and out on a very different basis than what you would typically expect in a physical retail space. We think about staffing very differently. We think about the responsibility throughout the experience very differently. And the end result that we're aiming for is ultimately a very warm and positive and comfortable feeling. And I think for us, that is built with a view to really understanding and accepting and appreciating the role of e-commerce in that equation, right? Rather than just sort of putting our fingers in our ears and ignoring it, or just trying to reinvent the wheel. We know what our role is and we know what the opportunity is, and it's about how we leverage that differently. And so, I think more and more retailers out there these days, more established, are starting to sort of come around to that sort of perspective today. And I think that's great. There's a huge amount of room for that to happen. But ultimately, the US, but really the world, is over-retailed. And there's a lot of these concepts, and it gives way to the sense that, physical retail is dying. And it's just not true.
Yeah.
It's really just that a lot of people lost track of what the opportunity is and should look like there. They lost track of the context in which it exists. In this case, accepting that convenience now exists elsewhere. And really thinking about how then you can really lean into some of these other aspects that could still make for something extremely compelling, very relevant and important, even in the balance of the industry.
It almost feels like, and this is something that I've said before, is retail never died and we never lost retail, but maybe the concept of retail did kind of die a little bit. And we're going through this renaissance now where we're almost going back to what retail and commerce was at the very beginning. If you think about like way before modern societies, where commerce was trade between two people talking about, I grew these crops. Here's how I did it. Oh, you have this woven shirt. This is how I made it. Oh, we can trade. We can share our stories. It really, the basis of commerce is connection and storytelling. And I think we did lose track of it after a while and became very over-retailed. And now it's coming back around to consumers really want that. They want to know who they're buying from. They want to know the stories. They want that relevance. I'm curious how you guys go about choosing the brands that do get placed in the store, because that feels like the merchandising of neighborhood goods is probably one of the most important pieces of it, is having really great, but also very relevant products to the consumers. How do you even think about merchandising selection?
Yeah, I mean, so I've mentioned it, right? But we predominantly work with a lot of different types of fairly modern, quote unquote, direct to consumer, digitally native brands. But there are many, many other types as well. We work with really well-known international brands. We work with very new and up-and-coming local brands, and really everything in between. The way we look at that is really ultimately paying attention to whether or not a brand has the willingness and inclination to do something interesting inside our space, and also whether or not we believe it's really going to resonate. And so we get it wrong sometimes. So we'll bring in a brand that just doesn't quite resonate. And so that's our responsibility in those situations, to try a different location. And like each of our locations, as I mentioned, serves a very different role for us. And so we have 3 stores today: Plano, just outside Dallas, South Congress in Austin, and Chelsea Market in New York. So very, very, very different purposes for each of those. So in Plano, you're accessing this sort of up-and-coming, affluent, suburban audience that is likely getting a lot of ads for a lot of these brands, but may not have actually tried a lot of them yet. But Dallas in general, or Dallas-Fort Worth in general, tends to be in the top 5 markets for most of these modern brands. At worst, top 10. But very few of them have physical presence here, let alone in Plano, where is really where a lot of the money is coming from. In Austin, meanwhile, you've got this very up-and-coming, really exciting street, very sort of buzzy, cool, hip, interesting. And a lot of these retailers, brands, lifestyle companies are showing up for the first time there. And a lot of brands have been trying to do pop-ups there for a long time, but the real estate is scarce. Yeah. But in New York, you've got, all these brands go to Soho, and it's kind of like the first place where most of them show up in the physical universe. But it's not necessarily the right area for everyone, right? Where there is good traffic and you can be very successful there, but you look at something like Chelsea and it's fully leased. It would be very expensive for a lot of these brands to show up. There's an amazing mix, certainly in a non-pandemic time, of office workers, tourists, visitors, and locals, right? And so each of these stores really unlocks something different. So you have a brand like Dollar Shave Club. We were their first ever physical. They show up in Plano. And we did like a 400 or 500 square foot experiment that had running water. There's this huge brand expression. Meanwhile, in Chelsea, they had a few shelves in a blended beauty and wellness space. And then in Austin, they had sort of a hybridized approach between the two. And so in Plano, they're really speaking to a new customer for them, potentially really introducing themselves, as well as potentially showing up in a very special way for these people that otherwise have been underserved from that sort of experience. In New York, it's more about re-engaging with active customers or lapsed customers and sort of sloshing into their day-to-day habits. And then in Austin, it was about a bit of both, right? And so when you start looking at it through that prism, you start to unlock a really interesting sort of framework through which you may look at brands. And it, I think, interestingly requires like a really good level of self-awareness for us around where we can and cannot be helpful and set you up for success. And we're not perfect, right? Like we don't always get it right. But more often than not, that system and that approach has been very productive and creates a really positive relationship. And so ultimately for us, we get a lot of brands that are applying through our site. We also have quite a few that come through our investors. And then there's a lot that we go out and pursue ourselves if we think they would be a really good fit. You have a real balance there. I think, at any given time, probably 50% of the brands come from inbound interest, but it fluctuates up and down. And generally, we have brands that are applying that are major household names. And we have others that you've never heard of before. And we don't discriminate. It's really more about, hey, is this a quality product? Does it have a good story? Diverse founder, sustainable materials, female founded, whatever it is. We look at all of that as well, of course, and really think a lot about that. And ultimately, the end result is that you end up with something that's really balanced with a lot of brands that historically really wouldn't be next to each other. And that creates something that feels really special. And then it changes frequently, right? So I think most brands probably sign up with us for 3 or 4 months. I think the average engagement's 9 months. But it varies. We have brands that have been with us now for upwards of 2 years, sort of almost going back right to the beginning. We have others that have been here for a few months, and we have lots of other formats as well. Last year, we introduced an initiative called the Commons, where we offered free space to brands that had been particularly hard hit during the early stages of the pandemic.
Wow.
We'll bring that back this year in a different format and with a different sort of remit. But there's really all sorts of different opportunities. And so you have brands show up for a weekend, you have them show up for a year, you have some show up that want to sell products, you have some that want to show up to tell a story and really profit from brand adjacency. You have some show up that's exclusively a focus on customer acquisition and marketing and data capture. Varies from one brand to the next. But ultimately, the unifying factor for us is, do we think they're interesting? Do we think they'll do well?
I love that you even broke this out into the by location kind of conversation, because it's something that I wanted to talk to you about as well, because we talk all the time about the power of local retail, and especially kind of post-pandemic, even, we have Shopify data that shows that a lot of consumers kind of shifted internally and wanted to protect the retail that was in their communities. And so Neighborhood Goods having these 3 different stores in 3 very different locations is so interesting to hear how the approach is different. And even the merchandising or the display or the design is different, because each local community reacts to things differently. They need things differently. And it actually, I wrote this note down as you were saying it, it circles back to something you said at the beginning, which, oh my goodness, I can do this. Relevance is the currency of retail. And understanding that each store has to be relevant to the local community around it, not just relevant to, whatever's going on in the large scale trends of the world. That is so interesting to me. And hearing you say each store has a different role and it's not all the same approach. I'm curious how you think about, as you went through these 3 cities and you've opened different stores, how do you even think about, getting to know that local community, understanding the consumers, and then activating a local community so they do know, okay, Neighborhood Good exists. This is who we are. We can go shopping there. How do you even start to get into that thriving from the local community?
Yeah, so there's no science to it. So to speak to the real estate thesis, which I think will illuminate a fair amount here, there's really 5 different types of stores we would do. So type A being major metropolitan, like Chelsea. Type B being up and coming, like Austin. Type C being suburban, like Plano. And then 2 that we haven't done yet. One would be type D, enclosed malls, which we haven't done yet. And then type E, which is either seasonal and or international activations of some description, which also we haven't done. If you then take the reasons why a brand would show up and think about those goals, and you break it out across, sales, product testing, marketing, customer acquisition, etc., and you sort of grade them against these different store types, you quickly find that the up-and-coming city like Austin is right at the top of the list, very closely followed by suburban/metropolitan, depending on the situation. Seasonal and international could be right at the top of the list, or it could be sort of 3rd or 4th, depending on the situation. And then malls are sort of towards the end. They can still be very useful, but you just have to approach it the right way.
Yeah.
So you think about it that way. And then you think about, okay, how would we design the store in a suburban market versus a major metropolitan one where, space is going to be very different. Our space in New York to the consumer is probably about 4,000 feet, whereas our space in Plano is 14,000. And so you start thinking differently about how many products you're going to show for different brands and all these other pieces. But to your point around community and how you think about really fostering those relationships, you start to really think about 2 things. One is F&B, the other is your team. So, on the team point, traditional department stores largely pay their personnel on commission. We don't.
Yeah.
We try to pay far more than typical, and we're always sort of trying to improve there so that we can have, a really long-term team in each of these spaces. So we have a lot of people that have been in our Plano space since the beginning, right? And because they're not motivated on just trying to haunt you around the space and sell product to you to make a living, you can build a longer-term relationship. And so because we built these inherently inconsistent environments, any form of consistency that you can create and derive from that space is very important. And ultimately, the personal and human relationships one, very important, but not for everyone.
Yeah.
a lot of people find retail experiences to be incredibly anxiety inducing and don't want to speak to people regardless of how nice they are. So there's that piece, and we think a lot about that and how we foster something comfortable. The other is restaurants, where we're thinking about how to foster a degree of magnetism to the space that really speaks more to day-to-day behavior. So because we don't own the product in the space, we're never really hosting sales. We do them very occasionally, probably 3 a year, largely to match just what our brands are doing around major holidays.
Yeah.
So, the sort of things you would see in a window when you walk around a mall or a major shopping center, lots of, big yellow sort of sales signs and everything else. We don't do it, right?
Yeah.
And so how instead would you foster a longer term relationship there? And I think food is a great place to start, where you can sort of bring people in and have them be able to come in, build that relationship and get comfortable over time, regardless of whether they start on the retail side, start on the food side.
Yeah.
There's something there within that ecosystem that really encourages like a very simple sort of set of behaviors that's very, very positive and memorable. And then you sort of start building on top of both of those things, right? So you start thinking about event programming. So in 2019, pre-pandemic, we hosted 2 to 3 events per week, every week for the entire year in Plano.
Wow.
And that was anything from like Serena Williams coming and launching a new product line to kids writing letters to Santa to making cheese boards, like all sorts, right? And so we've done major conferences, we've done product launches, we've done all sorts. And that helps build on top of that as well. Because again, you're giving people really good reasons to show up. In addition to that, because the products are always changing, those brands, we talked about 1,000 true fans earlier. These brands have been developing that, and they're at various different stages of doing so. And so when they let their communities know that they're there, and maybe their founders showing up to do an event or otherwise, and then you throw in a restaurant into that mix, really thoughtful stuff, you start to build something that's very magnetic and that fosters a very good relationship. And so ultimately, looking at Austin for us, for argument's sake, Austin opened on March 13th, 2020, and then I closed all the stores on March 14th. So it was open for less than 24 hours. And we're attached to the first Equinox in Austin, first Soho House in Texas, all these others, none of which obviously have been mostly open. Equinox opened last summer and everything else. So we have this huge marketing rollout. March 13th was meant to be the first day of South by Southwest.
Yeah.
Never got to do any of it. But that space has built a really loyal group that come in for restaurant, that have come in because they're excited about the brands. They come in behaviorally because they've gone for a workout. They've gone to, they're staying at a hotel nearby. They're shopping at some of the shops right next door to us, like Lululemon, Everlane, whoever else. And this becomes a point where you can gather. And that is ultimately where we see the ability to really grow these things. So it's not about saying like, come in and buy, right? I think the consumer these days is so much drastically smarter than most companies give them credit, right?
Yeah.
And no one likes the feeling of being sold to. And also no one likes receiving email all the time and all these other sort of pandering tactics. And we're guilty of sending email a fair amount, but ultimately it's about how can you reorient the experience and the offering around this very human sort of condition where it's around events, food, drinks, people, stories. That's how you can build something that endures, I think, because it's a very perennial set of offerings. It's not anything that ever really goes out of style.
Mm-hmm.
And so, certainly, you have some challenges around running a really great event programming lineup during a pandemic, but if you can still sort of find ways to let that aspect of humanity peek through, it's very, very meaningful. And it's just so drastically different. And you couple that with, our brand in general, where you look at any given department store, they're all trying to be the shiniest object in the room. They want to sort of exude some degree of perfection. For us, it's much more about affording ourselves latitude to experiment and try things and get things wrong. And we do it all the time, right? Like we are imperfect. And that aspect of fallibility built into it is helpful. Vulnerability, like it's hard to become friends with someone that comes across as perfect, right?
Yeah.
So, it's there's a lot of different tactics that go into it, but that's really the sort of baseline infrastructure for it. It's just this very simple sort of proposal of providing a space where you're going to feel very welcome, and if you're uncomfortable with that, we'll find the right way so that you can feel comfortable in your own way and find your way into that, and there's no judgment regardless.
Yeah, I love that it starts with the view of human behavior, of we're not like here on planet Earth just to walk into stores and buy stuff and walk out of the store and then walk into the next store and buy stuff and walk out of the store. Our natural human behavior is to be a social creature, to gather, to communicate, to have visceral experiences, to kind of activate all your senses. And then maybe out of that comes commerce, because then you're comfortable and then you can open up to the idea of purchasing something. And so just this concept of, okay, we can't just expect people to come in and shop the brands. We have to give them a reason to come in and have an experience, to have a visceral experience. And if we do that really well, maybe they don't buy something that first time they're in, maybe they do, but we've given them a reason just to come back to the space. And then you have the rotating brands. Maybe the third time they come into the restaurant, there's a new brand in there that all of a sudden they're like, whoa, that is me. And I really want to invest in this. And it's building those long-term relationships instead of the kind of like quick win, rapid fire of Facebook ads, Instagram ads, Google ads of just getting like one-off sales. Really starts to build that relationship, and then builds the community relationship, and then allows you to do a lot much cooler stuff. I think it's such a good tip for any retailers, especially smaller local retailers, trying to get people into their stores instead of just using things like sales and email and, the quote unquote marketing tactics. Can you actually just think about it from a more human experience zone and invite them into your space and then let the natural behavior go from there? I think it's just like probably one of the most valuable things we've pulled out of this show is that right there. So thank you for that. We kind of mentioned at the top where it feels like retail is going through almost like a renaissance. And then especially with vaccinations rolling out, the US starting to kind of open up, people getting more comfortable going shopping again. Almost this like return to retail starting to happen. I went to TJ Maxx about a week ago and there was a line out the door, not even because of like pandemic needs or anything, just because there were literally too many people there and they couldn't let everybody in. So I'm curious and I know like predicting the future is almost impossible, but if you have any thoughts on what kind of this next season or next phase of retail might start to look like.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, it comes back to a little bit of what we were just talking about and what you were just sharing, right? Where I think what's really sort of recentered us is around this opportunity to sort of contextualize products and socialize products, right? So we just launched our first new product category. We launched CPG in our Austin space as an experiment, an initiative called The Marketplace. Rather than just putting product on shelves, though, we've integrated a lot of those brands and products that you would otherwise really only find in your Instagram feed. And maybe if you looked hard in Whole Foods or otherwise, we've integrated them into the menu at our restaurant. And largely in ways that's like quite different to how they would typically be used. Like Fly by Jing, great seasoning, rather than just putting it on food, we've built it into a cocktail and otherwise.
Wow.
The power of that, right, is that you can then see, first of all, other people consuming it, using it. You also get some inspiration around how to use it, and it sort of helps influence some decisions there. And it also sort of like brings some of these things to life in a very useful way. And so talking to a lot of these brands in the CPG space in the past couple of months, what you hear from all of them is like one of the things they missed the most from the past year is sampling.
Yeah.
No one's been able to do that. But it's an incredibly meaningful piece of their business. And I think, that's very specific to the CPG space, but I do think it encapsulates a lot of where we're going from an industry perspective, where if you can sort of reground some of these products in like the why and like how they insert themselves into people's various different lifestyles, various different personalities, various different experiences, it's incredibly useful. And that's something that's relatively distinct and very sort of powerful in the physical realm, and it's something very hard to accomplish digitally speaking.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot there, and we're seeing so many interesting ideas start in all these different areas, whether it's CPG, whether it's in like, more interesting brands coming around, there's a huge amount of momentum there. So that's one piece that I see continuing, and we're really seeing the power of it now. And I think it's really helped crystallize a lot of our purpose going forward, right? Generally for us, I mean, as with probably everyone else at this stage, we're seeing our traffic and performance just shooting upwards, right? So we're consistently seeing better performance every week than Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Traffic is consistently above what we were seeing through holiday. Our restaurants in particular are growing incredibly quickly, where we're seeing, those grow, 50% month over month right now, if not more than that. And, with that, we're also seeing, even if you compare it to May 2019, our restaurant in Plano is up over 100% by comparison to that period.
Wow.
And so I think for us, the pandemic really helped to sort of reaffirm a lot of the direction and thinking we had around this concept in the first place. So for us, I think directionally and strategically, not a huge amount changes for us. We really continue down the path we've been on. I think in the more broader space, what we'll continue to see is a correction. And, we'll be touched by it. We're not profitable yet. There's plenty more for us to wrestle with and improve upon. But, we talked about the US and a lot of different countries being over retailed. And I think there will continue to be the push for those spaces to be rethought. I think a lot of malls will go away. And I think that's a shame. And it will have a big impact in a lot of different ways, culturally and societally. But it's probably going to give way to a lot of really creative thinking in terms of the balance of that digital and physical environment. And I think it also yields really interesting conversations around how these, people that work in retail, how they do work in retail, and how you foster something very positive there. And then also for brands, how you think about the various responsibilities and opportunities there. And so I think it's this moment to sort of, just to reiterate what you said, where it's really this sort of moment of a reset. Yeah. And I think it's really tempting for everyone to sort of try to gravitate towards what seems new, like augmented reality, virtual reality, things of that nature, NFTs, etc. And there's perfect merit to all those sorts of different areas and ideas. Ultimately, though, I think really what's going to have a massive impact on everyone is recentering on what are the most fundamental components of what a compelling physical experience can look like. And I say physical rather than just retail because I think it's going to touch a bunch of different areas, right? And so, there's real power in these more progressive, modern, mixed-use developments, whether it's gyms, offices, apartments, movie theaters, whatever it is. And it's really tempting to write off all those different types of businesses, but I just don't think they're gone. I think people are inherently social, and I think they like to gather. And, some people are more introverted than others, but they still sort of get energy from and can appreciate this sort of environment where they can go and either just be somewhere or be with someone and to sort of see it in that dimension. And so I think, there's going to be a huge amount of energy around where this goes. And I think ultimately what's really interesting about it is that people are looking a little bit backward rather than purely forward about the right rubric and framework to pursue in building something really positive and something that can endure. And so I think the challenge for everyone is looking at the sort of case study of department stores over the past 2 or 3 decades, where you see all of them just sort of express some degree of arrogance around a digital revolution, right? And it puts the gauntlet down in front of all of us to recognize that what we're all building and contributing towards here is, first of all, a much bigger conversation than any of us individually, but it's also an effort in building something and accepting that what you're building is never going to be complete and it's never going to be perfect. And I think that has to be a really fundamentally important aspect of it. And so regardless of whether you're building a small retailer or not, there's so much opportunity right now. And I think ultimately building those relationships and really thinking about how you have and maintain those is really the key to everything. And it comes down to things as simple as, the power of remembering someone's name.
Yeah.
And knowing what they might want in their lives. And otherwise, everyone talks about, personalization and localization with capital P, capital L in this industry. And ultimately what they're talking about is just being nice to people.
Yeah.
And offering them something relevant. So I think that's where we go.
Yeah.
I think physical retail certainly isn't going anywhere. Steve Dennis, another Dallas site, he talks about, physical retail isn't dead, boring retail is dead. And I think that's very true. And I think, there's just so much opportunity in front of this space. And it's going to be really interesting because there's a lot of incredibly creative and thoughtful people here that will really push it forward in a fun way.
I am so glad that you brought up Steve Dennis. I got to interview him twice in our preseason. So listeners, if you haven't heard those episodes, he's fantastic at talking about this. We go through kind of the 6 major impacts that COVID had on retail. And then in our second episode, we go into Steve's framework of the 8 pieces of remarkable retail. And that line is one of my favorite, it's what I come back to make sure the show is on track of that. Retail isn't dead, boring retail is. And that feels like kind of the statement of what the future of retail might look like is it is getting reimagined. And then I also love that you brought up it's getting reimagined, but that doesn't mean you only have to look forward at the crazy future ideas like NFTs and all this stuff that becomes hard to even understand. Almost going back to our roots in commerce and human behavior can be oftentimes even more powerful because we've kind of strayed from that. Matt, I only have one more question for you. We ask all of our guests this, and I am excited to hear your answer because I know it's going to be great. As the show is called Resilient Retail, and resilience feels like a very personal definition for a lot of people. Everybody has a little bit of a different way they look at what that means. So what does resilience mean to you?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think for me, and I think probably for a lot of entrepreneurial types, right? Like one of the most critical things that you have to try to undertake in trying to build your own company or pursue your own ideas is you have to have the audacity to do it on one hand, but on the other, you have to have an overabundance of self-awareness of your own shortcomings in order to be able to do it, right? And I'm certainly not perfect, but I think it's that knowledge of my own imperfections and failures and things I would love to have done differently that comes into a really important level of focus for me when I think about resilience in a very personal level. Beyond that, though, I think probably you could just chalk it up to not taking yourself too seriously and and just trying to sort of persist through various different moments that we're all going through it, and we're all sort of largely just sort of pretending we know what we're doing, right? And so I think probably something in there for me, if that counts.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been so inspiring, and I am excited to watch you guys continue to grow.
Well, thank you so much for having me.